Well, Florida State has racked up 3 consecutive ACC championships. Vegas is telling us that it's a 50-50 proposition between the Noles and the Clemson Tigers. We bring in Mike McDaniel of Inside the ACC to help us break down the Clemson Tigers. Mike, this has been the second best program in the ACC. There's no question about it over the last few years, but because they play that one game against Florida State for the division championship and have not been able to get past Florida State, it's been a difficult situation for Clemson. But I think the bull run of defeating LSU, Ohio State, and Oklahoma speaks to where Dabo Swinnery has brought this program from 7-8 wins per season to the nation's elite and a top 10 program. So let's start at quarterback, because Deshaun Watson has to stay on the field. He was a much better quarterback when he was in there for Cole Stout, who, ironically, the senior was the guy when the offense was less productive, was Stout in the lineup, and Deshaun Watson was the playmaker, and he's just special. So Deshaun Watson has to stay healthy, but that's been very difficult for him to do.
Yeah, I think that's a key aspect for Clemson this year is the health of Deshaun Watson. I think if he's not healthy, they're not going to do anything. The betting lines that have him a 50-50 shot, essentially, of winning the ACC will go straight out the window. Deshaun Watson last year was extremely impressive when he was healthy. 14 touchdowns, 2 interceptions last year, had a 68% completion percentage and threw for over 1,500 yards. And he missed a lot of time. I mean, he was in and out of the lineup and then, got hurt in the last game of the year and ended up sitting out the bowl game. So he had all sorts of knee issues, and he seems like he's healthy. So we'll just see if he can stay on the field. I think that's the most important thing for Clemson this year on the offensive side of the ball.
Mike, we hear 68% completion percentage from time to time in college football these days because the passing offenses have become that proficient. But to let people soak that in, true freshman, 68%, 14 TDs, 2 picks. That's a great ratio for anybody. And a freshman in Deshaun Watson being able to be that efficient and dynamic at the same time. They were just a completely different offense with him in the lineup last year. Wide receivers, this has become a program that has churned out NFL caliber wide receivers in recent years. Artavis Bryant going to the Steelers. Of course, Sammy Watkins, a top 5 pick in the NFL. And you got a couple of good ones in Clemson right now coming off big seasons.
Well, yeah, and they also had DeAndre Hopkins in that group. So they had 3 big-time receivers that have come out in the last few years. But right now, they got Mike Williams. He's a junior, and I think he's the best wide receiver in the ACC. Folks up in Pittsburgh might disagree with me with Tyler Boyd, but he's going to be missing the opener due to some off-the-field transgressions. But Mike Williams had 1,030 yards receiving last year. That led the team, and he had 6 touchdown catches. He's a 6'4" target, and he's a monster. They also have a sophomore, good-looking sophomore, Artavis Scott. As a freshman last year, he led the team in receptions, had 76 catches on the year and 8 touchdown passes, led the team in both categories. So those are 2 big-time targets that Deshaun Watson has to throw to, and it definitely makes life easier on a quarterback when you can just throw it up and have those 2 guys come down with it. Clemson, just time and time again, just keeps pulling these receivers in, and these are big-time players they got.
Mike Williams is a kind of a freakish kid in regards to size and ability. He, if you want to catch an amazing catch that he made. It didn't count. It was in the orange and white spring game, but he made an amazing one-handed catch, which these kids are making one-handed catches all over the place now. But this was a really freakish play by Mike Williams, and you mentioned over 1,000 yards for him. Artavis Scott, he's special after the catch. Had both of these guys listed as my top 5 wide receivers in the ACC and top 10 in the nation. I did go with Tyler Boyd with a bit of an edge over these 2 guys. But, Artavis Scott, and really came down. This is kind of as a maybe indicative of what Artavis Scott is capable of doing coming up here in 2015. His last 2 games of his freshman campaign, he put up 185 on South Carolina. That's a Clemson wide receiver record in that rivalry. And then he hit the Oklahoma Sooners for $114 in the bowl game. So he finished very strong again in that freshman season. But it doesn't happen if the offensive line isn't strong, Mike. So the offensive line, a bit spotty last season. What do we have coming up this fall?
Well, we got 3 new starters on the line, essentially, and they were in flux for much of last season, like you said, and that obviously is a key to the health of Deshaun Watson, whether or not this offensive line can get together enough here in the first couple of games against their cupcake opponents that they're playing so that, they can get some camaraderie there and, be able to hopefully protect Watson a little bit better this year. The two definitive new starters, Eric McLean and Tyrone Crowder, they've been with the program a few years now, but they haven't actually started a lot of games for Clemson, but they do have some playing experience. So they'll slide in at guard on either side, either side of their center there. And they have running back sophomore Wayne Gallman, who will be running behind those guys. He had almost 800 yards rushing last year and 4 touchdowns as a freshman. So there's a lot riding on this offensive line this season for sure.
All right, defensively, Vic Beasley, a beast. Grady Jarrett, also a very capable player. If you watch the NFL Combine this past February or March, you got to see that the Clemson defensive front was basically invited to the Combine. They were that good up front, and it wasn't just Vic Beasley. Again, Grady Jarrett, an exceptional player. Those guys are gone. There's really just 3 starters back defensively. So can you highlight what we need to look out for?
Well, they only have 3 starters returning, like you said, and replacing Vic Beasley is going to be no easy task. They'll be throwing all sorts of different guys in there. The one strong point of their defense, we thought coming into the season, was going to be their secondary. Now they have MacKensie Alexander. He's going to be a sophomore this year. He's a former top recruit, was looked at by all the major programs, ultimately chose Clemson. And he had 21 tackles and 6 pass breakups last year, and it seems like quarterbacks are already looking to throw to the other side. I mean, they're not really even looking his way, it seems like. They had Corin Wiggins, who was supposed to be their nickel back and perhaps slide into a starting safety role this year, and he just tore his ACL. So now even more question marks for his Clemson secondary, which was thought of as the strong point of their defense, and now even that's in question. So a lot of the success for Clemson this year is going to rely on 2 things. Number one, the offensive line, in turn, the help of Deshaun Watson. Number 2, how well this defense can gel with all these new starters and rotating parts. I think that's going to play a big part into whether or not Clemson can have another 10-win season and perhaps finally win an ACC championship.
Mike McDaniel joining us from inside the ACC. Of course, this Clemson team is scheduled home and home with Georgia the last 2 years, but they have no such difficult task to open 2015 with Wofford, Appalachian State. So 2-0. In the door right there. Then it gets a little bit tougher after that. So, Mike, I'm looking at a stretch here after that Appalachian State game on September 12th with Louisville, Notre Dame, Georgia Tech, BC, Miami, North Carolina State, and Florida State. That is 7 consecutive games against either elite or at least a formidable competition. So it's a tough slate for Clemson.
Yeah, it's a tough slate. Like you said, definitely 2-0 out of the gate, unless something catastrophic happens, of course. At Louisville there, September 17th is going to be their first real test of the year, and it's not going to be easy. They're going to have to go on the road on a Thursday night. Thursday nights at Louisville, I mean, that's a tough place to play. The crowd will be in it. They do have an off week the following week before playing Notre Dame. The one thing to note about Clemson's schedule, their toughest games on their schedule seem to be at home. Now, while they're playing at Louisville, I mean, they're playing Notre Dame at home, Georgia Tech at home, and they have Florida State at home as well. So in my eyes, the 3 toughest games on their schedule outside that South Carolina game late in the season are at home, which I think is important to determining whether or not they'll be favored in those games.
Yeah, when I size up these schedules with division play, I like to look at a few different things. Of course, the non-conference games, and Clemson's schedule difficult with the Notre Dame game was somewhat assigned as that ACC deal. And then they've got the traditional game against South Carolina to conclude 2015. South Carolina, 3 straight 11-win seasons, had a downer of a campaign last year at 7-6, probably a mid-level SEC team. So it's a difficult game, but not what it's been the last few years. And Clemson finally broke a 6-game losing streak against South Carolina. Then where I think it gets difficult here, Mike, is that they play in the toughest division. So they've got Florida State and Louisville. Don't have to play themselves, which makes that division the tougher of the 2. But on the other side, you only play 2 of the 7 teams, and they may draw the toughest possible assignment in Georgia Tech, who was, of course, the champion last season and a top 10 Orange Bowl winner. And then they draw Miami, which Miami's only coming off 6 wins, but they might be the most talented team in the other division. So tough draw for Clemson in those cross-division games against Georgia Tech and Miami. So it's a pretty formidable slate, one we consider to be the second toughest in the conference to Georgia Tech. So, Mike, anything else on the Clemson Tigers? What do you see here?
Well, I think going down to Miami October 24th will be a pretty tough game. NC State's going to be sneaky good this year. I think they could sneak up on a lot of teams throughout the ACC conference. I think that could be an interesting matchup there. But like you said, I mean, they're playing some pretty tough opponents up and down their schedule. The good news is they're getting most of those games at home. I think what's important to note about the home game against Georgia Tech, if they get up against the Yellow Jackets with their offense as good as it is with that rushing attack, I mean, they'll have a lot of trouble catching up. And I think Clemson is one of the few teams on Georgia Tech's schedule that can actually give them that problem. Because I think with, looking at Georgia Tech's schedule, which is just, kind of separate, but looking at Georgia Tech's schedule, a lot of the teams they play, they'll be able to get up on early and they won't have to worry necessarily about trailing a lot of these formidable offenses. But that Georgia Tech game will not be easy. Getting them at home is big. I think getting Notre Dame at home is big early in the season when the Fighting Irish may not have figured it out yet. But the Florida State game, I think November 7th could be the biggest game of the year and could ultimately decide who goes to the ACC Championship Game.
All right, the Clemson Tigers, one of the top 10 or 15 programs in the country. Is this the season they get by Florida State, finally get back to the ACC Championship Game? Got to win that game head-to-head and do better than 6-2 as they did in 2014 in the ACC. Mike McDaniel joining us from inside the ACC. Appreciate the look, Mike, on Clemson.
Yeah, thanks, Mark.